A warm welcome to all of our attendees. Thank you for joining for this very exciting webinar. The topic for today's discussion is the intersection of contract and supplier management. Why is it so critical to business success? I am Ajay Agarwal, founder and chairman at Sirion Labs, and your host for today. Before we get started, here are a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar slides and the recording of the webinar will be emailed to all the attendees. In case you have questions, and we welcome those, please enter them in the chat panel on the webinar panel. So we look forward to those questions. Over the a quick overview of the organizers for this webinar. EY, which is a global leader in assurance, tax, transaction, and advisory services, and the insights and quality services delivered by EY help build trust and confidence in capital markets and economies the world over. EY is today represented by John Edwards. We will talk about him in a minute. IACCM, which is our host and the organizer for today's webinar, and is the world's leading organization for enabling organizations and professionals to achieve world-class standards in their contracting and relationship management process and skills. Sirion Labs is transforming the way the contracting engagement between enterprises and contracting parties works, and we are a SaaS software product company, happy to be a co-organizer for today's event. Over the next 30 minutes, we will be covering the following points: how technology is bringing, what are the key gaps between contract and supplier management, how technology is bringing these two disciplines together, and how enterprises can unlock the value hidden at the intersection of contract and supplier management. So those are the key points that we will be covering today. A quick introduction to our webinar participants and my co-speakers. John Edwards, who's head of the vendor service integration VSI framework team at EY. He heads EY's global vendor management function, and that includes service integration, performance management, relationship management, and IT asset management, with more than 16 years of leadership, management, and decision-making experience in large-scale technology transformation projects. And John has been the architect of EY's recent governance transformation, and a very, very qualified leader to speak on today's topics. Paul Branch, who is the COO and CTO at ICCM, is a veteran in the telecom and IT industry for over 3 decades, with more than 20 years spent in various buy and sell side contract and commercial management roles. Until most recently, he was the head of deal assurance at BT Group. So wonderful to have Paul here with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to commence today's discussions.
Thank you so much, Arjun, and welcome everybody. So the intersection of contract and supplier management, why is it critical to business success? So let's get a couple of definitions out there, textbook definitions. So let's look first at contract management. Contract management supports the commercial management through the implementation and oversight of legally enforceable performance commitments. It's all around that end-to-end contract life cycle, which begins with design and evaluation, goes through authoring, negotiation, all the way through to post-award management, performance management, relationship management, all the way through to close. So in IACCM, we differentiate between that contract management thing and what we call commercial management, because commercial management is a discipline in its own right that informs and implements business strategy and policy. It's all about creating an environment of capability to support effective contract management. So that's how those two sort of fit together. Let's look at the second one on the slide there, supplier management. So supplier management is all around managing that entire life cycle of the supplier engagement that again begins at that design and evaluation stage, goes through selection, onboarding, and the in-life management activities of delivery, operations, performance management, risk and opportunities assessments and mitigation, relationship management, and indeed all the way through to close. So moving on to the next slide, if we could. Thank you. So from those pretty dry and bookworky type definitions of contract management and supplier management, John, question for you. In the real world, how do these functions typically, how are they defined within most organizations based on your experience in the real world?
Hello, Paul. Thank you for having me here. So the contract management is all around getting the things signed. Typically, it's usually about that life cycle of getting a template, drafting it, negotiating the terms, and then signing it. Usually it's a procurement thing. They get the thing over the line, get it signed, get the best price, and then put it in a database somewhere and track it. That's managing your contracts, which is one angle of it. Then your supplier management, what we've typically seen, is much more about managing the risks across multiple suppliers or vendors. So if you have a series of vendors working in the same space and they're all operating out of the same geography, that would be a risk. If they're all connected to the same infrastructure, that would be a risk. And that's typically what we've seen, and certainly within EY, that's contract and supply management in the old school.
Mm-hmm. So
the trick is, I second-guessed you there, forgive me.
Carry on. No, you keep going.
The trick is neither of those really hits what was the point of creating the contract in the first place. And that's what vendor management and really is what we define as vendor management within EY or supply management. What was the point of doing it? There was a business outcome for signing this contract. And what we want to know is, are we getting the value out of that contract through its life cycle? It might be 6 months, a year, 3 years, 10 years. And it's everything beyond the once you've signed it, maintaining the relationship and getting all the value out of the thing that you've signed.
So John, while there are clear owners for the traditional scope of contract management, mm-hmm. Clearly legal, absolutely procurement, and most definitely for supply management, most obviously in procurement itself. Based on my experience, the ownership of the operational elements of the contract, things like operation, delivery, in-life management, the processing of invoices and accounts payable, and particularly the relationship management, which can extend into the C-suite. Those activities are clearly distributed across an organization. So, mm-hmm. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, completely agree with that, John. Jumping in there,
sure.
This is Ajay, and I think the problem that you've described here, John, has become even more acute with a concentration of third-party spend in complex services over time. I think to the extent that contracts were simpler and more commodity and goods focused, this problem may not have been that acute, and it's been now complicated when people buy these complex services and many types of services from the same supplier with complex performance definitions, pricing structures, with shorter tenures and high amounts of changes and volatility in those structures. And that is a key factor why this gap between contract and supplier management, in your words, about focusing on the business outcomes is even more visible today.
That's really interesting. So as a consequence of that, what are the fallouts of this traditional approach?
I mean, what happens is that the management is decentralized in practice. The service owner or the business owner that signed the contract is typically their responsibility to manage that contract. But that person is probably doing their job. They're delivering their own internal services, managing their own stakeholders. They don't necessarily have the tools or the experience to do complex contract management. And contracts are getting even more complicated. The services and the definitions get more complex. A lot of software and SaaS software falls into this area as well, and it gets difficult. The other angle that happens a lot, particularly on when you've got a lot of software stuff, is that responsibility is handled to the supplier. And we leave it up to them. Sign a contract, leave it up to them. But you have a lack of transparency and you have a lack of trust between the client and between the supplier. And at the end of the day, you miss business opportunities, or your contract doesn't fulfill and doesn't meet the business outcomes that you set out in the first place. That's the main problem. We can define that as value leakage, which typically people then talk about dollars, hard dollars from invoices reconciliation. But I always try to think bigger that. It's like, what did you sign the thing for in the first place? Let's make sure we get all of the value out of that contract and out of that partnership that you can. Ultimately, that relationship, we want it to reach its full potential.
Absolutely, absolutely, John. And with almost $85 billion of annual contract value hosted on Sirion today, we're starting to see some very interesting data trends coming in. We've seen, for example, that while the larger amount of value leakage is actually quite high, somewhere between 20 and 30%, companies are able to recover 10% of this lost value by more effective governance. And by that, I mean literally by scrutinizing their invoices more closely. What we're finding is that in the manual governance mode, a lot of conversations between buyers and suppliers tends to be about my data versus your data. In fact, 80% of the issues, actions, claims, and disputes tend to be focused in this area. And last but not least, what we're finding is that manual governance tends to inflate activities on both sides in terms of tracking deliverables and outcomes. And more than 2.5 times of the effort and cost of governance is spent on these time-consuming manual activities.
It's really interesting that sort of jibes also with the results of the IACCM research that we've seen. Good stuff. So, question for you then, John. We understand the problem. So why has technology not been able to fix this so far?
Technology is only really one part of the problem. Practically speaking, a lot of this comes down to the governance within the organization, governance and empowerment within the organization to say who has accountability of driving those contracts and those relationships and making them successful. And that can be politically quite a challenge. So then that's one side. The technology vendors, typically they're going to respond with tools that are aligned to whatever function it is. The software tools are aligned to software. The application testing tools are aligned to application testing. There's not really been a focus on this particular area. People ask a lot about, well, what about your ERP? That costs a lot of money. But that's usually at the back end. That'll have a contract management module of some kind. You can pull out the PDFs of your contract, but it isn't truly bringing out everything that's in that contract and letting you manage it.
Yes, that's exactly what we've been seeing as well, John. In speaking to over 120 Fortune 500 corporates over the last 5 or 6 years, what we've seen is a pattern very similar to what you see on the screen in front of you, which is the functional silos, procurement, legal, business, relationship, risk, and finance, getting reinforced over time with the technology islands, because each of these functions tend to buy, as you very correctly observed, in their respective islands. There's no integrated approach that straddles the larger life cycle of the contract and ties together the various elements in terms of what was promised versus what was actually delivered. And that's the root cause of the problem, John. Completely agreed.
So I think we've whetted everybody's appetite, and so everybody's now real keen and eager to understand how we achieve this. How do we bring contract and supplier management together? And once we've done that, how do we assess that hidden value that's clearly at the intersection of those two things when we marry them together and drive incremental value? How do we release that? John?
Well, as ever, the answer is straightforward, as these answers usually are, but difficult to do in reality. You've got to have these things on the slide. You have to start with the executive support. You cannot drive decision making through your vendor ecosystem unless you have very strong leadership support that you will do this, because you're going to ask people to make decisions that they do not necessarily want to do. You've got to start there. You need an organization, and it needs to be in the right place. at the right time. You ideally want a centralized unit. That's the way we do it here within EY. We have a centralized global team that works across across a number of the functions to bring that together. Because otherwise, your vendor will and your supplier will go work with different bits of your organization. And unless you've got a centralized unit to pull it together, you won't know what's going on. And you need the right skills. It's quite challenging finding people who are really good at this. There's a lot of people out there who are experienced negotiators of contracts, very experienced in pricing, but few who are used to running these over time. But they're out there. Okay, then you have to prioritize. You cannot do everything all in one go. And when we started our journey at EY, we tried to do things in a very, very standardized way. We said, you must do this with all vendors. It didn't work. We had to segment the ecosystem very aggressively and pass out what is important and why is it important and what are we trying to achieve with those vendors. Once you've got there, then you're really into the visibility and alignment stuff. So again, take the EY as the example I know the best. We're very broad and we're very flat, and it's very important to have a single source of truth and a single vernacular, a single set of language, a single set of processes and places where to get data so you can do this consistently. But that's a very, very difficult thing to solve. The finance data is very challenging. You need a lot of support from finance to make sure you're getting all this information in the right format and in the right structure so you can make decisions with it. And ultimately, you do need some technology to help you. You can't really do all of this on spreadsheets and SharePoint, depending on how big you are. You can have a crack and you can get some way, but it is difficult. There's an enormous amount of sheer transactional work that you need to do if you really want to do this well.
Thank you, John. The really insightful set of bullets there. And I'm sure that your business transformation leaders that are tuned into this webinar, who are really looking to drive this transformation within their own organizations, are going to find those bullet points quite useful. The challenge, though, is how do you transfer those words into reality? So can you tell us a little bit about how EY's journey has progressed to make these a reality?
Sure. EY took a slow, steady approach. So the firm, again, as I said before, is very broad, very flat, very matrixed. We're not a global corporate. We are a global partnership of member firms, each of whom have their own operating committees, their own finance departments, and so forth. Even within IT, we're split into three. You can see at the top there. We have a CIO for our internal IT, a CTO for our client-serving technology, and a CISO for security. All of these functions are buyers of services, technology, goods, whatever it could be. So we used to be very decentralized. Each of those areas and each of those member firms had full control over what they wanted to do and how they worked. Then we slowly started to centralize. We set up a VMO, which is based around these circles here, to try and get the right contracts in place, support the contracts through their life cycle, and improve the relationships. It's steady, right? We took the big guns first, our major alliances and our major partnerships, and we slowly expanded bit by bit, recruiting very slowly as we go. We talked about big bang approaches, but we were very wary of it. And a lot of this relies on trusted internal relationships that you have to build up over time, and building up trust with your suppliers as well. We've recently started working with Syrian to automate some of the gathering of that data. Look forward to the results of that coming form. It's going to be very exciting. And we will see how that develops as it grows. Our next stage on our journey is effectively going global. So right now my scope is very focused around IT, and we're looking to broaden that and see how broadly we can push vendor management.
Sure. Interesting. So RJ, as a CLM tool, Sirion brings some pretty comprehensive features to the table. You combine some of those core contract management bits of functionality that we talked about at the beginning with specialized supply management capability. So Without doing a sales pitch, it'd be really great to hear a quick overview of the specific functionalities that can help drive that convergence of contract management and supplier management.
Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah, absolutely. These are very good questions. I think for me, the best way to understand technology is to place it in a time continuum. And the first thing that any technology should really be answering is, what are you doing to help me negotiate my past? I already have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of contracts. Are you bringing any technology that can automatically read those contracts and extract the operational data from them? Not the legal metadata, not the insurance and the liability and the payment terms, but the actual deliverables, obligations, service levels, and rate cards. So that's the first part, is can we use smart technology to do that? The second part then is, now that we know what the business end of the contract looked like, what the parties expected from each other, then can you help me to connect the dots and actually figure out what the actual performance or the operational reality was? And the only way to do that is by connecting with the gigantic service provisioning systems that are there today, whether it's ITSM systems, holding service request data, or project management systems like Clarity, or other project management data, or Jira for application development. There are thousands of, or logistics databases, there are thousands of such systems where the granular activities of the third-party suppliers are being tracked at an atomic level. And the question is, how do you connect that atomic level of activity with the 100,000-foot world of the contract? So that elasticity, that interconnectivity with those systems becomes the second bit. And that's where, again, we at Sirion have been using elastic technology to forge that link between these distributed performance environments and the contract management world, to connect the dots between what was promised versus what was delivered. And once you have an idea of what was in the contract and what was actually delivered, it should theoretically become mathematically possible to predict what the supplier's invoice should be. And I am not talking of simple P times Q invoices. Those can easily be validated on existing P2P networks like Ariba Network or Coupa Network by the simple application of price times quantity. I'm talking about more complex invoices, which are based on forecast-based or RCROOK-based or performance-based billing mechanisms. And in those cases, using more advanced algorithms to automatically identify the consumption versus the right invoice, and to audit the incoming invoice of the supplier, then for me closes that final loop. So one is handling the past, two is in the present, and three is the predictive or the future invoice. For me, that's the continuum on which technology should exist in order to drive that. And of course, if you have that kind of end-to-end or past, present, and future landscape sitting inside the technology, then there will be a lot of very powerful data that will accumulate there over time, that will allow you to understand what kinds of suppliers tend to live up to their promises, what kind of contractual terms are meaningful because they correspond to both the CSAT surveys and the applied penalties, and which ones are unnecessarily harsh or unnecessarily lax. And last but not least, and I think this for me is a very critical feature of modern technology, I think one of the most important reasons, and I would be very curious to see Paul and John's views on this, one of the most important reasons why traditional CLM, ERP, and P2P technologies tend to struggle is that they tend to operate in the back end. And the reality is, with most of our complex contracts today, what we really need are systems that connect us with the third party, that allow us to have a shared ledger of common expectations and to track on the same page with them, rather than my data versus your data and reporting at the end of the month. So would be very curious to get John, your and Paul's views also on these on some of these priorities that we see.
John would like to go first. I've got some views, but I'd be interested to hear yours. Okay, I'll go first. Oh, sorry, coming off mute. Back to you, John.
Exactly what I was doing. Yes, couldn't click the button. The bit that really struck home on that one, Ajay, that I wanted to reinforce was the back end angle, because I think it's really important. It's incredibly important for a vendor management function like this to serve their customers on the front end. You know, to have the way that we run it within EY is almost like a consulting shop. You know, we're there to support, we're there to help, we're there to make your life better, take work off you, and increase the value of your contract. And that ethos and that mindset, that customer front end focus versus we're sitting at the back crunching numbers, doing a thing in the background, was kind of one of the first critical philosophies to help us engage throughout our organization internally and get the buy-in from our stakeholders. So and I was just listening to you talk, and that was the one thing that resonated the most strongly. If you make this a back office function and you say, well, it's just to crunch invoices, much more difficult to be successful. I'll pass to you there, Paul.
Thank you. And just to echo that, I think that number 5 point there is really important. And it's the ability to share one truth up and down the supply chain. The technology is evolving to help us do that. So blockchain's an obvious candidate there. The other piece, though, I'd like to share is certainly in my experience in the real-time integration of all these back office systems to provide real intelligence, real insight. Historically, that's been really expensive to do, to get all these APIs to work. Technology, though, is now enabling much more feature-rich APIs to enable this sharing of business information and business intelligence into tools like this that can then be used to provide actionable, as it says here, these actionable insights back into the user community. With an eye to the time, though, guys, we are coming up to the end of our session today. What a really great discussion. I think we probably have just 2 or 3 minutes left for Q&A. So, RJ, if there's any questions out there from the team, perhaps now would be a good time to share those.
Absolutely. I will request my colleague DJ to walk us through those questions and to bounce them off the participants.
Sure, Ajay. The first question is, and John can take this one, which enterprise function is best suited to lead this transformation?
Great question. Within EY, we have based it within the Office of the CIO function, which is a relatively classic function that runs program change, vendors, and a number of other aspects. There's 2 parts to that really. That gives us a very cross-functional view. The role of a classic OCIO team is to look right across the business and introduce standardization across those services, and it provides very good air cover for me as I go out and working with those stakeholders. It means it's not just me on my own. I'm part of a larger portfolio of services that we're looking to standardize and enhance across the organization. That's worked very well for us. There are other ways of doing it, but that's what we've done within EY.
Yeah, I've seen it driven within the procurement team too, and that works well as well. You know, you get stakeholder engagement up to the C-suite that way. Yeah.
There's a real question there. You've almost got to go one way or the other. You could fully do it within procurement, or you could do it fully out. There's pros and cons. For us, we are outside of procurement and we are within technology, but then we have to work, and we do work with our procurement colleagues every day.
For sure, absolutely.
Thanks, John and Paul. I think we can take one more question here. Ajay, you can take this one. How should one go about evaluating the right technology to support this program?
I think a lot of that answer really is in the 2 slides that I presented a minute ago. For me, the starting point, as Paul and John also pointed out, is to pick a platform that will allow you to share a common set of expected outcomes with the external third party. There's no point going through all the pain and grief of negotiating some very specific contractual outcomes and then to have competing or adversarial views of what those outcomes mean. I think it's very important to have technology that can use whether it's blockchain or permission ledger or any other way of sharing the expectations across both parties. The second, and again, I think Paul also made this point, is to leverage the advances made in recent API technology, whether it is RESTful API architectures or even more advanced frameworks like MuleSoft or Workato, to do very, very quick integrations with distributed sources of raw performance data and to start connecting those dots with the contracts. And then last but not least, and I think this is equally important, is to leverage advances made in recent technology to automatically read and absorb the content of thousands of contracts. Because if this is left to be done manually, it is inevitably a task that will flounder.
Thank you, Ajay. Unfortunately, we've run out of time and we won't be able to take any more questions. But on behalf of the panelists, I would like to thank all our audience for attending this webinar with us. And we will, as we said earlier, we will send out the slides and the recording to everyone. And there will be a survey at the end of this webinar. We request everyone to fill that out for us. And please do join us for more such events in the future. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.